Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Rosanna Francescato, Communications Director with the Clean Coalition. We're excited today to host this webinar on how deploying more local solar and storage will save Californians billions. Especially in light of another depressing IPCC report, I think it's important to remember that we have solutions available now, and studies like the one we'll cover in this webinar are key for moving forward the policies that we need to deploy these solutions. So, before we get into that, a few quick housekeeping items. We will email everyone the webinar recording and slides within a couple of business days. Also, all of our webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, under events. If you have questions at any time during the webinar, please go ahead and type them in the question pane at the right of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A, which will follow the presentations. And if you have questions about the Clean Coalition, you can contact me at rosanna@clean-coalition.org. We have two great presenters joining us today. Before I introduce them, I want to just start by setting the stage for today's webinar, including who the Clean Coalition is and what we're about. The Clean Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy in a modern grid. Our endgame vision is that we will get to 100% renewable energy within the next 2 decades, and I know you all get how important that goal is. At the Clean Coalition, we're focused on the 25% of that endgame that we believe needs to come from local renewable sources. But I do want to clarify that the Clean Coalition does believe we'll still need to get up to 75% of our energy from remote sources. So there is a very important role for remote energy generation and for the transmission system. But local renewables do provide significant benefits that remote generation just can't provide, like local jobs and resilience. And the transmission system is incredibly expensive. In fact, transmission costs are absolutely out of control throughout the country. And in California, they're the fastest growing component of electricity bills. Here, transmission already costs about the same as the energy itself, and soon it could even cost more to move energy around than to generate it. And this is partly because of how the market is designed. Transmission is guaranteed a pretty crazy return on equity of 12%. This outdated business model creates massive market distortions and conflicts of interest, like the transmission access charges distortion in California, and it leads utilities to make spurious arguments for building out more transmission when it's often not really needed. I just want to mention briefly that transmission costs are much higher than they seem, because when you add operations and maintenance plus that ROE, transmission costs go up 10 times beyond their initial capital costs. And of course, these costs are borne by ratepayers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all the details in the slide, but as I mentioned, we will send you the slides later. So transmission costs to ratepayers are huge and growing. And in California, we have a huge market distortion in the way transmission access charges, or TAC, are metered and assessed. And that means that California ratepayers are paying more than they should for the transmission system, and that local renewable energy projects are disincentivized. So here you see an illustration of the distribution grid and the transmission grid, and TAC are the usage fees for the transmission grid. In California's investor-owned utility service territories, these fees are being metered and assessed incorrectly at the customer meter, as is shown here. And that means you can't tell whether that energy came from the solar rooftop next door or from a power plant 1,000 miles away. They're treated exactly the same, regardless of the fact that the remote energy used the transmission grid and the locally generated energy didn't use it at all. Now, in municipal utility service territories, on the other hand, TAC are being metered and assessed correctly at the substations between the high voltage to low voltage transmission lines and the low voltage transmission lines to the distribution grid, as you can see here. So the way that TAC are being assessed in IOU service territories just doesn't make sense. It's like paying extra shipping and handling fees for something you picked up next door, or paying a toll for the Golden Gate Bridge if you pull into your driveway at home. You know, we hear a lot these days about cost shifts, but this is the real cost shift that's happening in California. So we have to fix this. And why do we have to fix it? Not only because we ratepayers are paying these costs, but also because TAC distorts the market by making remote energy generation look a lot cheaper than it is. 3 cents per kilowatt hour is being stolen from local renewables, which makes them look more expensive. And these charts show how that's happening. You know, people talk a lot about economies of scale of utility scale solar compared to rooftop solar, and you'll hear more about that later in this webinar. In the chart on the left, you can see how when we ignore the transmission costs, remote generation does in fact look cheaper. But when you transport that energy over the transmission grid, you have additional shipping and handling costs associated with the transmission. And that comes to that 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So once we fix the TAC distortion and make transmission costs visible, as you can see in the chart on the right, then local renewables actually look a lot more cost effective, and you get resilience and many other benefits from local renewables at no extra cost. Now, since overall transmission costs are increasing rapidly, of course, TAC are also increasing. In 20 years, TAC are expected to be at 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's where you get the levelized cost of TAC at 3 cents, which, by the way, is about 50% of the average wholesale cost of electricity in California, so that's huge. The Clean Coalition did a deep analysis on this, and we found that if you fix the TAC market distortion, we'll end up with a lot more local renewables over the next 20 years. If you continued with business as usual, as you can see in the blue line at the top here, we'd have something like 12% of our energy coming from local renewables. But if we fix TAC, we can get that to over 30%, and that'll save Californians over $60 billion over 20 years. And of course, we'll have much better outcomes for local renewables. And I want to point out that this is not just theoretical. We actually know that deploying more local renewables can save us money. In fact, in CAISO's 2017 to 2018 planning process, they deferred $2.6 billion in planned transmission spending, and that was in large part because of increased deployment of local renewables as well as energy efficiency. So how do we fix TAC? Our proposed reform is simple. Only charge transmission fees for energy delivered through the transmission system. I know, radical idea. And also have procurement reflect both the energy purchase price and the delivery charges. There's a lot of support for this reform. We've gotten over 85 organizations to sign on to our campaign, and we are making progress on legislation which is needed to make this happen. If you'd like to join in this work or sign on as a supporter, please contact me or go to the links shown here. Now, TAC reform may seem like a sort of wonky, obscure issue, but it's key to deploying more local renewables, and which will lower costs for all ratepayers. In fact, our two presenters today are going to show us how deploying more local renewables will actually save us billions of dollars. So we're lucky to have these excellent presenters with us today. Carl Rabago operates Rabago Energy. He has more than 30 years of experience in energy and climate policy and markets, and he's recognized as an innovator in utility regulatory issues relating to clean and distributed energy services and technologies. And Bernadette Del Chiaro is Executive Director of the California Solar and Storage Association, CALSA. Since starting there in July 2013, she's built CALSA into the largest clean energy business group in the state. And she's also been a leading voice on many energy, California clean energy initiatives for a long time, even much longer than that. You can read more about our presenters on the event listing for this webinar on our website. And as I mentioned, we will send everyone the link to that, which will include the webinar recording and slides within a couple of business days. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carl to continue our presentations and get to our main event today. All right, take it away, Carl.
I'm going to unmute myself and go into presentation mode. And hopefully everybody can see a slide in front of them that says
Yes.
California Local Solar Roadmap. And we're going to share a roadmap that we constructed through the Local Solar for All Coalition, working with Bernadette and member companies of hers, as well as others across the country, showing a roadmap that we constructed by working with a company called Vibrant Clean Energy, an exciting modeling business that is based here in Colorado, where I live, that has developed one of the most powerful models we've seen for looking at utility system planning and what we should do in order to achieve true least cost solutions. I am struck by how much this talk is going to dovetail with the work on TAC pricing reform, because what the the current tax issue in California, I think, really demonstrates is the way our old ways of thinking get in the way of the new solutions we need. I think it was Edwin Land, that the inventor of the Polaroid camera, who once famously said, in order to have a new idea, sometimes we just need to stop having an old idea. So I want you to join me in a little bit of new idea having, a rearranging of our mental furniture to talk about how modeling better can help us move that furniture around and think about new ways to address resource planning for the electric grid. I'm going to go through a lot of the technical presentation, and then at the end, Bernadette's going to come in and share with us some of the policy upshot, and then hopefully we have time for a question or two. So what's the conventional thinking? Why would you create a tax system like California has and make so many other assumptions? Because once upon a time, and seemingly forever in our brains, we have thought that the bigger the power plant, the less expensive the energy. And while that's true even today at what they call the bus bar, the point where that energy is made, if you don't look at the whole system, you can fool yourself into thinking that big power plants is the only way to get the least cost. And then you allow yourself, if you're stuck in that old thinking, to consider any newcomers, especially small distributed newcomer technologies, to be, you consider them to be too expensive to use as a solution, especially with all the hard work that we have to do to clean up our energy grid, not just in California, but everywhere. What this new modeling exercise, what this work that we've been doing for well over a year now, actually going back a couple of years, has teaching us is that if we can look at more of the system, if we can consider more data, if we can take a more complete look at the resources and the relative costs and benefits of each, we will discover that local solar and storage can be as more cost effective, and that a blend of the right sized resources, some utility scale, some small scale, can actually give us a least cost solution. You can come away with the conclusion like we've listed here, that if we build more distributed resources in California, not less, if we advance policies that support growth and the scaling of local solar and complementary storage technologies, we can come up with savings for everyone in California, teaching us another way that California can lead all of us in our clean energy policy goals. So let's jump in. Let's open our minds to a new idea and understand what we did in this study. The first thing is just the simple overview. What do we do? Well, again, using one of the most advanced models available in the world, I actually don't know of a more advanced model. We ask this question: if California were to sustain its market growth for rooftop and other distributed solar, enable markets for distributed community solar and storage as well, could we come up with a lower cost solution? Would the benefits outweigh the cost? Simple cost effectiveness question, but need a complex model to answer it right. Here's what we found. I put the sort of the prize right up front, but I'm going to explain to you what these all these numbers mean and how we got to them. But basically, if we grew local solar in California to 25 gigawatts out to by the year 2050, and we allow a market for distributed storage to simultaneously and appropriately evolve, you in California could save $120 billion compared to an all utility scale future. You would grow that distributed storage, as I said, by 60 gigawatts, meaning you would grow two industries for the price of one. That's double the benefits. You would avoid carbon dioxide emissions faster and more, and you would create as a bonus an additional 374,000 jobs over a utility scale only future scenario. So pretty big deliverables on optimizing distributed energy resources like rooftop and community solar along with distributed storage. Let's get into how we did it. The first thing you need to know is that we relied upon the WisdomP model from Vibrant Clean Energy. This is a model that is the first utility model I've ever seen that is actually built for big data. So unlike some of the models that are being used in proceedings in other places that have been tried to be stingy with the calculations they perform so they don't overstress the model or simplify down the analysis so that it'll fit on an Excel spreadsheet, this model jumps right in with more and better data. In fact, trillions of calculations and 10,000 times more data points than used in traditional utility modeling. Having the ability to look at that many things means you can look not just at big resources in big chunks, but you can that provide electricity as supply, but you can also look at the cost of supply plus the cost of transmission plus the cost of distribution so that that electricity can get to load. And that means you can break through what has been a brick wall in utility planning, the distribution system, and you can actually optimize your distributed resources to deliver the lowest cost plan for the entire system. This model does amazing things, and I'm going to share with you just a couple of the highlights without getting too nerdy. Oh no, I'll get nerdy. I just can't help myself. So let's get into this. So I mentioned the barrier. Look at this chart and look at the two sides of this diagram. We've got it as a thin white line as a barrier. Traditional utility models only spend all their time on the left side of this diagram. They assume static levels of demand or demand as a fixed set of values that are forced into the model. They assume weather driving that demand according to historical analysis based over a course of like 30 years of historical data, and then normalize for the extremes that we're all suffering through right now. The WisdomP model, because of its superior computational capability, can actually pierce that line, cross that border, and pick little resources as well as big resources to choose the least cost solution. As we all know, when you have more choices, you make better decisions. This model gives more choices and therefore sets up better decisions by enabling a true systems view. It allows regulators and planners, it allows regulators and planners to actually pursue a least cost strategy and ask more questions. And asking more questions is also a path to better solutions. So what did we ask? Well, we asked the model to compare two starkly different scenarios because there's been a lot of debate in California about this so-called cost shift that comes from encouraging distributed generation. And this debate, the old conventional thinking says, every time we use distributed resources, we add to the cost and we add to the cost shift. So we said, fine, left side model scenario, let's get to our policy goal of 100% clean by 2050. Let's accomplish economy-wide electrification of transportation and heating loads. Let's use outmoded model thinking and not take advantage of distributed resources at all. Let's build this the way some people say we should build it, the big power plant way, and see if it's really less expensive than the options on the right. The option on the right is a local solar and storage future, in which we told the model to add levels of local solar, and as well that would also add storage, though we specified only the solar amounts. We told the model take advantage of the ability to optimize those resources, cross that barrier that I showed you in the previous slide, and let's just see what's really the least expensive. I won't say cheapest, because I don't think you want a grid that's cheap, or you've had a grid that's cheap. What we want is the highest value. We want the highest benefits and satisfaction of demand, at the lowest cost. This model says the local solar plus storage future is what gets you that solution. What did we put in the model? This is a table of the data. So we said rooftop solar, here are your specific amounts and the years in which to add them. Community solar, here are your specific years and here's the amounts. We actually put them in two different categories because we wanted to make sure that we got all the benefits of robust rooftop solar programs and community solar programs, all of which are distributed. If there's economies of scale or other benefits that come from community solar, we don't want to miss them. If there's individual opportunities from rooftop solar, we don't want to miss them. Now, we put those all into the model and we said, again, in that second scenario, does this cost more or does it cost less? Here's a graphical demonstration on the top graph of the solar we told the model to add. And then as the first wonderful payoff, you look at the graph on the bottom, which is the storage that the model added as well. Like I said, this is a twofer. You not only do you get robust and self-sustainable levels of distributed solar, but you also get a robust, powerful, reliability and resilience enhancing fleet of storage, including both local storage, distributed storage, and utility scale storage added to the California system. What happens to the total mix? The thing I want you to take away from this graphic is that there are more colors on the right than there are on the left, that there's a broader distribution of resources. This is talking about a future for California in which you have more diversity in your energy resources, allowing for, again, more of that resilience. The things that go down, the fossil, some of the utility scale renewables, but the things that really come up on the top of the right-hand side of this are your rooftop community solar, that distributed and utility scale storage. So you get a more diverse, robust, resilient, reliable grid if you take advantage and optimize your distributed resources. How does this turn out? Well, the big takeaway on money is that you save right from the start, and you save even more in the later years starting around 2040. Why is that? Well, because the model makes the reasonable investments in transmission and distribution system to take best advantage of both the utility scale resources and the distributed resources. I'm going to explain this in more detail later because that has been one of the biggest aha results of this better modeling capability. And what's the number? $120 billion for all Californians, along with lower electric rates, if you pursue a future that takes advantage of distributed resources. How does it do it? Okay, why is the number so big? This graph shows you. Now, this is the place where I get most nerdy and perhaps most excited. This is a typical curve. If you look at the top of the shapes here, you'll see the typical curve of how the utility system operates, meaning that less than 10% of the time, the left-hand side of this diagram, we are meeting over 70% of demand. We all understand that to mean that the utility grid is peaky, but you got to build to satisfy that peak. So one thing everybody's going after is how to reduce those peak costs. And distributed resources do a great job of that. But because this scenario we created to optimize distributed resources was included and analyzed, we find out that these resources actually contribute value, shave that blue off the cost across 80% of the hours in the year. Why is that? Well, because distributed resources don't just meet the demand, they actually change the shape of the demand that the utility system sees. They don't just meet demand, they change the shape of utility system demand. And that has the benefit of getting more out of all our utility system investments. That means it contributes to lower costs on the big and little side of the utility equation. And that's how you get to $120 billion of savings. If you load the system with the distributed resources that some people say we shouldn't be building any more of, that would be a $120 billion mistake. Here's another view, just in case you like these kinds of diagrams or you want to come at it a slightly different perspective. This is a comparison, top two versus bottom two, of what happens when you have that optimization, that old style thinking versus the old style thinking with optimization turned off versus the lower two in gold where the optimization function in the model is turned on. And what's the big takeaway? It's the shape of the thick black lines. On the utilities, even utility scale system sees a lot of variation, a lot of bumps in the line that have to be accommodated in order to match that distribution demand, which has the same difference in shape. When you start taking advantage of those just little resources, those smaller scale resources, you fill in those dips. You flatten the overall line, and a system that can run more uniformly costs less. So you lower total system costs by adding distributed energy resources. It's a value those resources produce that no amount of utility system investments can really solve, because it shapes the demand at the place where the demand occurs. Source of savings, big savings. What else? I told you earlier on that you'd get some extra benefits on carbon dioxide emissions. This graphic is honest. It looks like it's not much, but the difference between the local low solar and storage optimized scenario and the utility scale is actually 4.1 million tons. This accelerates achieving your carbon reduction goals and gets those accelerated benefits before you even get to 2035. What that does for policymakers, it gets us an early down payment on CO2 emissions reductions, which is kind of insurance against uncertainty in later years. It's worth it, and it's that many years of emissions that are not going up in the atmosphere where they can reside for 100 years, causing global climate change. Finally, as I told you, this scenario adds lots of jobs. The localized local solar and storage scenario adds lots more jobs. Distributed resources are more labor intensive. You get a benefit of 374,000 additional jobs under this analysis using local resources. And we didn't even value those jobs in coming up with the 120 billion. So these jobs and the benefits of these jobs are on top of those savings. There are other savings that come from this approach as well. Where do the jobs occur? In every county in California. Everyone in California benefits from a clean, distributed, optimized energy future. So what does it all bring for you? Again, the highlight numbers. If you intentionally build a sustainable level of distributed generation of 65 gigawatts, 65,000 megawatts of solar by 2050, and allow it to also be paired with the distributed storage that is necessary, all Californians will save $120 billion by 2050 over an all utility scale future. You will get a complementary industry of 60 gigawatts of distributed and utility scale storage. You will accelerate your carbon dioxide emissions reductions, and you will create 374,000 additional jobs by choosing the local solar and storage pathway. That's what you want, I think. That's what I would want for California. The question is, how are you going to get it? This is where Bernadette steps in and shares with us some important ideas about policy to make this opportunity reality. Bernadette?
Great, thank you, Carl. Yeah, I think what Carl and what the WisdomP model shows is where, points us in the right direction. But as everybody, knows, that policy is what really drives markets. That's what really drives that future that we all want to see. So we've got, we could spend a whole 2-hour webinar just on policy. We've got it boiled down into just one slide. So I'm going to keep it necessarily very high level. But I think it's, the first few bullet points are pretty obvious. We, need to make sure that we continue to grow, first, the behind the meter solar market in California. We need to and can provide a special focus to make sure that that growth is throughout the state, in particular, making sure that communities of concern catch up with the rest of the state. And we can do that with deliberate and well-known, well-executed policies like net energy metering, virtual net energy metering for apartments, and make those policies, like under the NEM 3 proceeding currently ongoing at the PUC, make those policies work better for everybody. The last thing California should do is pull the plug on net energy metering and slow down the growth of rooftop solar. At the same time, as the model suggests, and as Carl correctly elaborates, we have the opportunity to grow another technology, which is energy storage. We need to make all of those, take all of that abundant sunshine that California is famous for and put a bunch of it into a battery to use at night when neither the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. And this is how we get to 100% and really truly smooth out those bumps that Carl showed on that previous slide. And so we need to grow behind the meter energy storage along with and accelerate that growth with the solar piece. And we can do that through direct incentives, like extending rebates at the state level. We can expand the investment tax credit at the federal level. We can also do government purchasing programs to make sure that our schools and our fire stations and our hospitals are equipped with solar and storage. And then we can tie all of these technologies together with very, deliberate policies to grow virtual power plants and grid modernization programs. So max out and extract out all those different values that sun-charged batteries can provide to everybody in the state, whether they've got that battery in their garage or at the school playground or not. Third is we need to maintain our longstanding tradition of focusing on the costs. And most importantly, the most stubborn costs are those associated with permitting. It is a little understood and not very, kind of sexy tech policy piece, but it is incredibly important for both commercial and residential deployment of solar and storage is the permitting piece. Luckily, we have a Department of Energy that is now very much focused on this app called the Solar App that they have developed as an open source, free to use technology for all building departments throughout California and throughout the nation to significantly reduce permitting costs. And we also need to continue to focus on interconnection barriers. We in the industry are starting to see some significant barriers being thrown up by PG&E and other utilities, especially around energy storage. So it's a little bit like deja vu all over again. Things that we have worked out on the solar side, we're having to work out all over again on the storage side, and it's becoming a bigger problem. So we need to focus on that. And then we need to also, as Carl mentioned, really focus on competitive community solar programs that can utilize distributed energy, energy storage, and see an expansion of net metering and improvement to the green tariff. So there's so much more California can do to grow community scale solar, community owned co-ops and other ways of putting these technologies in the hands of Californians and their communities. I think I just want to wrap this first bullet up with the old way of thinking has held back distributed consumer solar and storage in all these different forms. And we need to just move beyond that and we'll see all of these different ways, these different policies to grow the different little submarkets, we'll see them flourish. The second thing is we need to make sure that all of our state energy planning and policy discussions really integrate and optimize local solar and storage. So we need to adopt new grid planning processes that require the utilities to provide critical data that they hold on to behind a black box that's going to help our regulators unlock those values. We would advocate at CALSA that all state agencies and also our local agencies, our public utilities as well, start using advanced modeling tools like this one to help them plan out for the future. And that we need to make sure that that all of these and savings are sufficiently captured in the models, and we move beyond. Last thing I'll say, and I'll pass it over to you, Carl and Rosanna, is, I was really impressed with an interview I read of Winona LaDuke in the New York Times over the weekend, where she mentioned that, we are coming out of COVID. It's like passing through a portal, and we can choose as a society what comes through the other side. And we would all argue that what should come through the other side of this global pandemic experience that we're still in the midst of, we should really bring only the clean stuff, the smart stuff, the stuff that's going to work for everybody and work for our future. And so I think it's with that, kind of that vantage point that this, as technical as this webinar is, the big picture is we're at an inflection point of what does our clean energy future look like, not just with the NEM 3 decision, but with so many other decisions affecting how we build our clean energy future here in California. And of course, where California goes, so goes the nation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Wow, thanks, Bernadette. Yeah, wouldn't it be a shame if we went through all this pandemic, how it's upset and changed our entire lives, all the suffering, if we didn't come out of it better and more focused on what we need to do? That's a wonderful way to finish this up. I'm going to turn on my camera. I think we can I guess we can leave this in the background if we want to go back to any slides, but that wraps up our presentation, and we have room for some discussion now.
Great. Thank you, Carl and Bernadette. Excellent presentations as always. And I appreciate you leaving up the slides in case we want to refer to those. We've had some good questions coming in, and Bernadette, I think you were starting to touch on this a little bit in your presentation, but a couple sort of larger picture questions about how, what do we do with this great study that we have now? We have John Knox saying, Carl makes a very convincing case in favor of the new model and a local solar and storage future. Has he had the opportunity to present this, or will he be able to present this before the decision makers, the CPUC? And Carol Lewis, owner of Upstart Energy, asks, what's needed to go from plan to implementation? We have a lot of more detailed questions too, but this has been on my mind too. Like, this is an amazing study. Now, what do we do to get it out there and make something happen based on it?
We are reaching out in several ways. I sent a personal note of invitation to each commissioner on the PUC offering a presentation on this. I'm personally not engaged in the net metering proceeding, and there are all the rules about ex parte conversations and all that. I'm trying not to cross over into that space, but we've made that invitation. We're also offered that invitation. We've also, there are people, I know Dr. Clack and others are having, I believe, are trying to have some conversations, and we've offered to provide his resources to the staff of the advisory staff or the at other commission staff if they want to learn more about it. And of course, we're using all our social media and other mechanisms to get the information out there. Bernadette, you want to add? Are there other ways we can get this in front of them?
Yeah, I think what you just said really is the very first step. This is news. This is a brand new model, brand new study, never before done, and it is really important that it gets in front of these decision makers, both at the Public Utilities Commission and at the Energy Commission, and that we really start to understand that the models that the PUC has been using and others are outdated. They are models that were built basically in close coordination with the utilities, and they need to be looked at with fresh eyes and in the context of this study, and they need to really look at and consider why are the results so starkly different. Everybody that's done any kind of modeling knows that a model is only as, the output of a model is only as good as the structure of the model itself. And so I think the question is an excellent one to kick things off. It is going to be up to, I think, our political leaders to understand that the ramifications of our policies being so dependent on the old way of doing things is such that it's going to cost Californians, in this case, $120 billion more. So it's imperative, not to mention we need to keep the lights on, we need to stop sparking wildfires. There's so many other values that the model doesn't even capture, right? I mean, Carl, the model doesn't capture the economic value of a reliable energy grid or a reliable source of energy. Right. That's an additional value for all Californians. And so it is a political decision. All of these things, every public policy decision around energy is inherently a political decision about what your priorities are. So it's a great question. It's going to be up to our political leaders to make sure that all of our policies that affect this market take into this kind of math and this kind of equation into consideration.
I want to add just two things real quickly that are very important. I neglected to mention one of the things that's so powerful about this model is that instead of looking big and chunky and first asking a generation question and then a transmission question, I already emphasized how this model can look at things as a total system. It also looks in with great detail. It looks down to 3 square kilometers, 1 kilowatt, 5 minutes. The old models that had to be so stingy with their computing power couldn't get that resolution, and not being able to see at that fine resolution is like having blurry lenses on your glasses. It's just, yeah, you might be able to make out general shapes, but what you think is an arm might be a leg. It just doesn't work until you really get focused. The second thing is that there are so many more benefits that we don't have the time to talk about. One of the exciting ones about storage is that if you build both distributed storage and utility scale storage, you actually can pass power back and forth between them in a way to optimize the total system value. You simply don't get that option if you pursue the utility-only solution. And that $120 billion that you reminded that we keep emphasizing, that's just a starting point. Every time a private customer business brings another dollar to investing in rooftop or participation in some kind of community solar or storage facility, they are adding to the savings that all ratepayers will receive, because the model doesn't know who pays for it. It just tells you what the cost is. But if people will pick up some of that burden, as they have for decades in California, you increase the value of a clean distributed energy system for everyone. So lots more benefits out there, lots more opportunity that comes with cleaning up your lenses and getting a little bit of a better focus.
Great, thanks. We do have some more detailed questions, but I want to ask another kind of big picture one, because I think this is also on a lot of people's minds, especially with the IPCC report. Brett Garrett asks 100% clean by 2050 seems too slow. Have you looked at 2030 or 2040? And George Beeler asks, is it possible to meet new California goals of 100% renewable energy by 2035? Did the model look at that? Or, I'm assuming that you could put those inputs into this model, right?
You could put those inputs into the model. We did not ask the model to do that in this run. And because we really wanted to focus on isolating that utility scale versus utility scale plus distributed resources question, right? And we didn't want to create this space where people would say, well, yeah, but. There is lots of yeah ands. It's not very expensive to use this model because of the way it was built, and we would encourage policymakers to take advantage of that. Dr. Clack has released a number of previews analyses on a nationwide basis. You can learn more about it by going to his website and his 0 by 50 work and other stuff to see what happens. It's easy to do. It'll change some things, of course. It'll change some costs and stuff, but we haven't run it yet, but it can be done.
Let me just add, the time space kind of analysis, it's almost above and beyond just the simple cost analysis this study is focused on. And you touch upon it, Carl, the model touches upon, carbon reductions that we get. You mentioned we get more carbon reductions sooner with a distributed future. But from a time scale perspective, we cannot get to a faster time. I mean, we can't get to any of these goals without distributed generation, period. And many people have opined about how distributed generation, actually far from being a competitor to the utility scale market, is an enabler, right? It brings all of the pieces together and ties that all up into a more efficient system. But putting all of that aside, it takes years to build utility scale projects, easily a decade, and transmission lines in addition to that. We're building 400 solar systems every single day in California. It's a natural gas power plant worth of energy a month. I mean, building clean energy into our built environment is the fastest way to build renewable energy, and storage is right behind, and we're streamlining it and packaging up these systems and getting them UL listed and tested so that they can just be plug and play, all with that clock and that time scale in mind. So it's almost another reason why, in addition to costs, California must not slow down and turn down the dial on distributed energy resources, but must do the opposite, because these technologies are plug and play and easily adaptable into the human scale landscape where we use energy.
That's so important. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and this might be a good time to mention that we talk a lot about rooftop solar, and a lot of people think that's solar on people's houses, which it is, and that's great. And it also means commercial scale, and that's a really underdeveloped market in California and generally the United States. And it's a market that made Germany a global solar leader with a lot less sunshine than we have. So there are a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of siting opportunity in our urban environments. So that's a good point. And I also want to mention, I think someone also asked about weather studies coming up for Arizona. And Carl alluded to this, there have been other studies done. There was one for the whole country, and I'm sure there will be many more to come. We'll send you some links to things that are out there when we send the webinar recording and slides, so you can keep track of those. But yeah, there are more studies. And
yeah, it's important. It's important to recognize that Vibrant Clean Energy is an independent business. We hire them to do this work, and they're very proud about keeping their sort of business doing what their business does. They work for people all the time. I have no idea how many I know they've done a lot of work. Those of us in the Local Solar for All Coalition have commissioned these studies now in California and Illinois. I will sneak preview and tell you there's some New York stuff coming up pretty soon. And then, of course, like you mentioned, Rosanna, that we've done the lower 48 states, which we released back in December. We don't have specific plans to do Arizona right now, but I have heard talk about it because it's a leading solar state, and there's been some pushback on distributed resources. There are other things also possibly in development. We're looking at doing some additional national runs as well, because now we're going to have some more signals out of the federal government about what kind of policy they want to talk about. We want to make sure they don't miss the distributed resource opportunity when they go through that work as well.
Hey, Rosanna, can I hop in and just make a quick announcement? It's relevant here. I just got word, maybe many of you on here got word too, but the California Energy Commission just now, while you were talking, Carl, unanimously adopted another first in the nation set of building codes to incorporate solar and energy storage into all commercial construction. So really amazing, and to make all homes storage ready, and to put in place some incentives for builders to start to decarbonize. So just literally build natural gas-free appliances in the homes. So it's really a huge step forward for California, but here's the but. If the Public Utilities Commission, the other agency just down the road, if they pull the rug out from underneath net metering, they will pull the rug out from underneath all of these new building mandates, because they are based on cost effectiveness for the consumer. And if you slap on penalties and you reduce the compensation, you erode the value of net metering, you erode the value of distributed generation technologies, and you're going to jeopardize these new policies. So on the one hand, historical moment here, major kudos to the leadership at the California Energy Commission, and on the other hand, the intensity of the spotlight now on the Public Utilities Commission to not give in to the old way of thinking, to embrace the future, is even now more intense. So sorry for that public service announcement. Hot off the press.
That's great. And you mentioned distributed storage before as well. We have some questions about that and about net metering. So Peter Levitt from Peninsula Clean Energy asks, distributed storage has the same peak demand management capabilities as utility scale storage. What is the basis of the claim that distributed storage can manage peaks better?
It has to do with being able to take that system's perspective, right? So you know, the traditional thinking on the model is you figure out what is it at the bus bar, at the place it connects to the grid. And then later on and separately, you ask, well, what about moving it from here to there or where it has to be? So when you have a model that can actually tell you, well, this is the loading on this distribution system line, this is the loading on this transmission system line, this is a great time to move that power from here to there. This is not such a good time to move that power from here to there. You start giving you give yourself, for the first time ever, the opportunity to really get the optimal moment and location for discharging or charging up on that distributed storage device. And that's where those differences show up. It's the piece as part of a live, dynamic, active whole, and being able to ask all those questions and look at all those data points at the same time.
Another way to look at it, Carl, is that what helps me understand it is we are primarily a transmission constrained grid. It doesn't matter how much power generation or energy storage is on the other side of the transmission infrastructure. What matters is the size of the straw through which the electrons move in order to power your toaster oven. So if we wanted to just if we overbuild the transmission system for that 2 hours of peak usage on a hot August afternoon, that is an incredibly inefficient way to go. Instead, if you add in distributed resources and storage, it's not about the capacity, it's about the ability to meet load on site and bypass having to build a bigger straw, right? And so that's where it's also as you mentioned, it's the ability to move things around and be responsive. That's possible down where people are using energy and where it's being generated. It's not possible at the kind of old way of doing things, which is incredibly rigid in its approach.
We're all thirsty. Why design a system as if we were all drinking from a fire hose? Yep.
Yeah, and this relates to a question from David Woolley, director of the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy, who says, I've heard an argument that distributed storage is high cost since the utilization of residential scale storage is lower than utility scale storage. Is that a legitimate concern, and are there ways around that? And I think you kind of address it with what you just said, because, you know, having the local storage has, even if it's not used all the time, has benefits to the grid, right?
Yep. Well, you know, it's fundamental that we understand that price, cost, and value are different, right? So a very high-priced resource can have even higher value if it can provide service at a critical time without needing to, for example, use the transmission system. So we really just have to be clear about these things. Yes, you might get better duty cycle and you might get, you know, better kilowatts per dollar invested at a utility scale, but you still got to move it from there to here, and you got to do it at particular times. And it's only by comparing the full range of costs and benefits that you can come up with a fair assessment of value.
And I'm not even sure it's accurate to say that there's more utility scale battery energy storage. We have about 50,000 grid-tied battery energy storage systems installed in California, 20,000 more than what we had the last blackout in August of 2020. So there's actually a really large market, but let's be honest, energy storage is just starting out on both the utility side and the distributed side, and we need 5 times more of both to get to our clean energy goals. So it's really not an either or, it's a both, as Carl, you've said really well. But we're off to the races on the distributed side because consumers are demanding solutions to blackouts and wildfires, right? So policymakers need to consider what consumers really want and need.
Yeah, and I think that question was kind of getting at that, you know, people with storage in their homes aren't using it as often. But of course, if we can help use that to provide services to the grid, then that's a way we can use the storage more even when there aren't blackouts, right? So there's a lot of opportunities for that distributed storage as well.
Well, you know, Rosanna, you're making a really good point, because this model can't tell you how people behave, right? And it can't even, this model, it's not possible for it to even design rates, right? Like is going on in the net metering proceeding. That humans have to take this opportunity, this roadmap, and say, this is what I think will keep us. These are the guardrails that will keep us on this path towards savings. So if customers aren't using their distributed storage in a way that really maximizes the benefits, we should be asking why. Are we compensating them when we want to rely on them? Are we compensating them fairly? These were ideas that, you know, that I got real involved with when we did value of solar back in Austin, you know, 15 years ago now, more. Gosh. Anyway, you know, well, not quite, 10 years ago. That there's still an implementation, and Bernadette keeps banging this drum because it needs to be banged, that this is the opportunity. We've put it in front of you. Now you should have policies and implementation to match. I think the building codes example is a perfect one. You can write the best building code in the world, and you should, but you got to have rates and service models that take advantage of it.
Yeah, and I think Bernadette also made a great point, which is kind of the point of the whole study, that it's not either or. You know, the study really showed how these work together and how distributed solar can actually help utility scale as well. So that's really crucial. We've gotten a lot of questions about NEM, and there's a lot more questions than we're going to be able to get to. So sorry to those that we can't get to. Robert Borlick, Senior Energy Advisor at Borlick Energy Consultancy, says, why is net metering needed if distributed solar produces billions in savings? Why not just allow the owners of the solar to sell their energy into the market at the prevailing market prices? And why not let the utilities install the rooftop solar facilities if that lowers their revenue requirements versus going with utility scale solar?
Look, because, quote, prevailing market prices is a wholesale energy price that is not the same as the retail service. It's an apples and oranges kind of question. Net metering is people who generate primarily for use, but also, and thereby change the shape of the load, but also have an opportunity to export energy into the system during times when it's most valuable. That's not a wholesale calculation. That's a retail calculation, and it needs to be considered in concert with how the wholesale system works. What this model does is says that if you take advantage of those resources from an electrical and economic operational sense, you can achieve these savings. The policy regulator question is, what do you need to do to get people to install this stuff and use it? That's the question that's on the table. And the easiest answer on net metering is don't do any harm. Bernadette said it. I'll say it again. The last thing anybody should be doing is gutting California's distributed energy programs, and certainly expecting homeowners to become energy traders so they can maximize the benefits of their rooftop and systems or their community solar participation and their storage systems is not the way to get the maximum value for the investment.
Yeah, there's a lot more, we could go on about net metering for a long time, but do you have time for just one more quick question about transmission?
Yes.
I'm kind of wondering, to what extent does the model account for savings from transmission? We talked before about how we have already deferred really expensive transmission investments. And Ron Martin from Fresno's Against Fracking asked, does the model consider savings from things not burning down as long transmission lines are eliminated and stop starting forest fires? But I think beyond that, there's just, transmission lines are just very expensive. So how did the model account for that?
So the model can't account for things like, the fire thing of it assumes the system works as the system is intended. And if it's not being properly maintained or something is going on, the model can't do that. You can put in some assumptions about failure rates, replacement rates, capacity values, and all that is done. What it is doing, and this is a really good question because it allows me to emphasize a key point. The model solves for least cost, just like all the utility capacity expansion and production cost models. The ultimate goal is least cost. We said utility scale only, what's the least cost? Distributed energy resources, what's the least cost? And the least cost of the distributed was much less expensive. So it looks at, when do I need transmission? When do I need distribution? When do I need generation? What kind should I use to satisfy each 5-minute increment of demand out to the year 2050? And we could try to run a model in which we said, well, just act completely the way they do. We kind of isolated that with the utility scale resource, and I can tell you that the total benefit, which shows up in generation cost, total capacity cost, transmission capacity cost, distribution capacity cost, is 120 billion. Can that be parsed and isolated with sensitivities and other scenarios? Yes, it can. But your total system cost, which is what we pay on our bills, would be $120 billion less if we take advantage of these distributed resources. That's this level takeaway. More analysis could show even more exciting things.
And just to add on to that, this is the job of policymakers to take information like this and apply it to the real world. It's impossible for any one model to guess what will be the expense of inaction, right? The expense of inaction on climate change, the expense of inaction on creating a grid that's not sparking wildfires every other month. All of the job and at local economic development that comes from building our clean energy future in our communities. Those are all values, the protection of open space, right? These are things that have intrinsic and real economic value, but no one model can really take that onto consideration. This is the job of our policymakers, and they need to tie all these pieces together. What this study does is takes the false claims around the cost shift off the table so that hopefully policymakers can go back to the question of, how do we get to our clean energy future as quickly and cost effectively as possible, and in line with what the public is demanding?
What she said.
Yes, and I think that's a great note to leave it on. This really is a good argument against that whole tired old cost shift argument. And it's a great resource. And let's hope that, policymakers really take a good look at this and we get some of the right action that we need. So thank you both so much for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the great questions. They were really pouring in there by the end, but really appreciate you joining us and everyone else who joined us. As I mentioned, we will send everyone the recording and slides, and those are also posted on our website, clean-coalition.org, under events, where you can also see future events. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.